It was supposed to be the happiest night of his life. The sprawling penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton still smelled of roses and champagne, its marble floors scattered with petals from a wedding that had dazzled the city only hours earlier. The champagne glasses were half full, the wedding cake lay untouched on a silver tray, and the bride's gown, white silk now wrinkled and stained, was sprawled across the carpet like a ghost abandoned mid-dance. And then there was the body. Elena, the radiant new bride who only that afternoon had glided down the aisle to a chorus of applause, now lay lifeless on the edge of the bed. Her neck bore the dark, unmistakable bruises of strangulation. Beside her sat the groom, Malcolm Graves, a man who until that very night had been considered untouchable. He wasn't just any husband. He was a judge, one of the most respected legal figures in the state, a man whose black robes symbolized authority and whose name was synonymous with discipline. To lawyers, he was a stern arbiter. To the public, he was the face of order. And yet here he was, stripped of all that dignity, sitting in silence, his hands trembling, staring at nothing as though the life had drained out of him too. The discovery wasn't made by detectives or family members, but by a young hotel attendant. Early that morning, when room service trays went unanswered and the sweet silence felt heavy, she tapped on the door. No response. She knocked harder. Still nothing. Finally, with a master key in hand, she eased the door open. What she saw would never leave her mind. The scream she let out ricocheted down the hallway, drawing security and guests alike. Within minutes, police swarmed the suite, flashing cameras already trailing close behind. The image stunned even seasoned officers. A bride in her wedding dress, strangled before dawn, and the groom, an esteemed judge, caught at the scene. When the news hit the wires, it tore through the country like a lightning strike. Judge Graves arrested for bride's murder scrolled across every major network. Headlines blared on phones, tablets, and televisions. The courtroom titan who had once sent murderers away for life was now being escorted out of a hotel in handcuffs, his face pale, eyes hollow. But the shock wasn't just about who had killed whom. It was about the betrayal that set it all in motion. As investigators began to piece together the night, whispers leaked from behind police lines. The judge had discovered something on his wedding night, something that shattered the picture-perfect love story and set off a chain of rage he couldn't control. By the time dawn broke, a secret long buried had surfaced, and with it came the downfall of a man once believed to embody justice itself. For the guests who had toasted to the couple just hours earlier, the contrast was impossible to comprehend. They remembered the champagne flowing, the judge's rare smile as he held his young bride's hand, the applause echoing beneath chandeliers. Now, those same people sat in their living rooms watching the news, faces pale, trying to reconcile the elegant man in the black robe with a broken figure slumped in a police cruiser. The case didn't just shake a family or a courthouse. It rattled the entire country. How could a man trusted to interpret the law turn into a killer in the span of a single night? Was this the story of a respected figure driven to madness by personal betrayal, or the truth of a man who had always hidden behind authority until his mask finally slipped? These were the questions that reporters asked, that talk shows debated, that neighbors whispered to each other at grocery stores. As the cameras captured the judge's slow walk into custody, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary crime of passion. This was the implosion of an icon, the unraveling of a myth, the brutal collision between private secrets and public life. And it all began not in a courtroom, but in a hotel suite meant for romance, now transformed into the most infamous crime scene in the nation. Judge Malcolm Graves had always carried himself like a man carved from stone. Tall, broad-shouldered, even into his late 50s, with a stern jaw and piercing eyes, he was the kind of figure who silenced a room simply by walking into it. For nearly 3 decades, his black robe and gravelly voice had been fixtures in the state courthouse. Defendants trembled under his gaze. Lawyers sharpened their arguments, knowing he would cut through theatrics to get to the heart of the matter. To the public, he was the embodiment of justice, unbending, incorruptible, and sometimes unforgiving. He was also a widower. His wife, Margaret, had passed away over a decade earlier after a battle with cancer. That loss carved deep lines into his face and deeper ones into his heart. Friends remembered how, for years, Malcolm buried himself in work, presiding over back-to-back cases and rarely speaking of anything beyond the law. He raised 2 children who were grown and long out of the house by the time Elena entered his life. His colleagues whispered that the judge seemed destined to grow old alone, married only to the bench, until suddenly he wasn't. When Elena appeared at a charity gala 2 years before the wedding, she caught everyone's eye, not just for her beauty, but for her composure. She was strikingly younger, with smooth dark hair, delicate features, and a charm that disarmed even the most skeptical. For a man like Malcolm, whose life had been defined by order and discipline, her presence was something unexpected, even intoxicating. At first, their connection seemed improbable. She was in her 30s, vibrant, moving easily among artists, philanthropists, and business elites. He was nearly 60, a man more accustomed to chambers than champagne. But what began as small talk over glasses of wine soon evolved into something that neither could ignore. By the following spring, they were inseparable. Malcolm, who rarely took vacations, was suddenly spotted on weekend getaways. He began leaving the courthouse earlier than usual, something his clerks had never seen before. Elena, for her part, seemed utterly devoted, always by his side, gazing up at him during public appearances as though he were her entire world. To some, it was heartwarming, proof that even the most stoic men could find love again. To others, it was suspicious. Too good to be true, murmured a few colleagues who had watched the whirlwind romance unfold. But Malcolm never wavered. To him, Elena represented a second chance, a rare gift laid in life. He introduced her to his children, who were polite but distant, wary of a woman barely older than themselves stepping into their mother's shadow. Still, Malcolm pressed on, determined to prove that his love was real. He wasn't a man used to being questioned, and in matters of the heart, he believed he had earned the right to happiness. His reputation in the legal community only amplified the fascination surrounding his relationship. Malcolm Graves was not some backroom judge coasting through minor disputes. He had presided over some of the state's most high-profile cases: organized crime syndicates, corrupt politicians, violent offenders whose names filled headlines. He was known for his sharp wit in court and his scathing rebukes of anyone who dared disrespect the law. Journalists often quoted him, calling him the hammer of justice, a man who never bent to public opinion or political pressure. In many ways, he had been the backbone of the judiciary. That's why his engagement to Elena became a spectacle in itself. When word leaked that the austere judge had proposed to a woman nearly half his age, gossip columns lit up. The society pages ran photos of them dining in upscale restaurants, her hand draped lightly over his, the diamond on her finger catching camera flashes. Talk radio hosts debated whether it was a love story or a midlife crisis. But for Malcolm, the noise didn't matter. He was finally allowing himself to feel again, to step outside the cold shell he had built after Margaret's death. Friends noticed subtle changes in him. He smiled more. He seemed lighter, less weighed down by the grim details of his courtroom. Even his rulings, some said, softened slightly, though no one dared say it to his face. Behind closed doors, however, Malcolm remained the same man, structured, commanding, rooted in values he had held for decades. To him, honesty was non-negotiable, order was sacred, and deception was the greatest sin. These principles had guided his career and would later prove to be the very fault lines that cracked open his personal life. As for Elena, her background remained something of a mystery. She claimed to have studied abroad, dabbled in fashion design, and worked briefly in public relations. Her stories were polished but vague, the kind that charmed in passing but didn't invite scrutiny. Malcolm never seemed to care. His faith in her was absolute, as though her presence alone was enough to silence any doubts. He introduced her at judicial functions, and she dazzled the room. Younger judges envied him. Older ones quietly nodded, relieved that he had finally moved on. By the time their wedding invitations went out, No one questioned whether the union would happen. It was a given. The ceremony promised to be the event of the year. A powerful man reclaiming joy, a beautiful woman stepping into the spotlight, and a community ready to celebrate what looked like a fairy tale. But beneath the glittering surface lay secrets neither vows nor diamond rings could hide. Secrets that, when revealed, would shatter everything. The wedding of Judge Malcolm Graves and his young bride was not just an event. It was a spectacle. From the moment the invitations went out, embossed in gold and sealed with a wax crest that carried the judge's initials, the city's elite knew this would be no ordinary ceremony. Everyone who was anyone wanted to be there. Politicians, attorneys, philanthropists, and former defendants whose lives had been forever altered by Graves' rulings all angled for a seat. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a performance staged under chandeliers and camera flashes, a story of redemption that played perfectly for the public eye. The ceremony was held in the grand ballroom of the Bellington Hotel, the kind of place where ceilings soared 30 feet high and every inch gleamed with marble and crystal. Rows of white roses lined the aisle, their fragrance mingling with the faint sweetness of champagne already waiting on silver trays. Guests murmured as they took their seats, women in sequin gowns adjusting their hair, men in black tuxedos checking their cufflinks. They whispered about the couple, about Malcolm's reputation as a stern judge, about the age gap between him and Elena, about whether this was true love or something more complicated. Then the doors opened, and all speculation fell silent. Elena appeared, radiant in a gown of silk and lace that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Her veil trailed behind her like a river of white, and the hush of the room was broken only by the faint sound of the string quartet swelling into song. For a man who had spent decades buried in case law and criminal codes, Malcolm looked almost boyish as he watched her glide toward him. He held himself tall, but there was a flicker in his eyes, softness, vulnerability, that those who knew him professionally had never seen. The vows were simple but heartfelt. Malcolm's voice, usually sharp in court, trembled slightly as he promised to love and honor her. Elena's words were gentler, wrapped in a tone that suggested she had waited her whole life for this moment. When the officiant declared them husband and wife and Malcolm leaned down to kiss her, the ballroom erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Some guests dabbed their eyes. For a fleeting moment, it felt like everyone was watching a fairy tale unfold in real time. The reception only amplified the extravagance. The tables were draped in ivory cloth, topped with arrangements of orchids and candles that glowed like small fires. The menu boasted filet mignon, lobster tails, and vintage wine uncorked with precision. A 12-piece jazz band played in the corner, filling the air with swing and romance. Guests toasted the couple endlessly. Speeches painted Malcolm as a man reborn, a widower who had found new light in his later years, and Elena as the perfect partner who had breathed life back into him. There were moments that stood out. Malcolm dancing stiffly but with effort, Elena's laughter ringing out as she pulled him closer, the judge raising his glass during the toast, his voice booming as he declared, "To second chances," the sight of the two of them cutting into a towering 5-tier wedding cake, white frosting smearing Elena's finger as she teased him. To outsiders, it seemed as if every barrier of age, status, and history had melted away. Yet, beneath the glittering surface, the cracks were already there, though few noticed. Malcolm's children sat at a corner table, smiling politely but exchanging glances that betrayed unease. A few of the judge's closest colleagues whispered in hushed tones about how fast the relationship had moved. And somewhere in the mix of champagne and applause, there was a strange current of tension, the kind that lingers when a story looks too perfect to be real. As the evening drew to a close, guests threw handfuls of petals across the marble floor while the newlyweds made their way to the elevators. Elena clutched her husband's hand, her veil gathered like mist in her other arm, her smile luminous under the hotel's golden lights. Malcolm looked every bit the triumphant groom, raising a hand to acknowledge the cheers. The cameras followed them to the elevator doors, catching the final glimpse of the happy couple before they disappeared upstairs. For most weddings, that would be where the story ended. Two people carried away by the promise of forever, their guests departing with full stomachs and fond memories. But for Malcolm and Elena, that elevator ride marked the beginning of something darker. By morning, the same hotel that had hosted one of the city's most glamorous weddings would become the scene of its most shocking crime. The suite door clicked shut behind them, muffling the fading echoes of applause and laughter from the ballroom below. For the first time all day, there were no cameras, no speeches, no curious eyes following their every move. It was just the two of them in the penthouse, the glow of the city skyline spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the silk curtains with streaks of gold and silver. A bottle of Dom Perignon rested on ice near the bed, untouched, while the remnants of rose petals trailed across the carpet like breadcrumbs leading to their night of supposed intimacy. Malcolm set down his jacket, unbuttoning his collar, his stern face softening in a way few had ever witnessed. Elena moved gracefully, slipping off her heels and letting out a quiet laugh as she collapsed onto the velvet sofa, her wedding gown pooling around her. For a moment, they were simply husband and wife, relieved, exhausted, basking in the surreal glow of their union. He poured 2 glasses of champagne and raised his in a toast. "To us," he said, his deep voice rumbling like a closing gavel. She clinked her glass against his, smiling. But as the night wore on and the wedding clothes gave way to intimacy, the fairy tale began to crumble. It happened quickly, almost imperceptibly at first. Malcolm's hands, steady and deliberate in the courtroom, faltered as they traced the contours of her body. His expression shifted, first confusion, then suspicion, then something darker. He froze, staring at details he hadn't expected to find. The faint scar lines on her lower abdomen, the unfamiliar shapes beneath delicate lace. His breath caught in his throat. "What is this?" His voice was low, strained. Elena's smile faltered. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his eyes sharp, dissecting her like a witness under oath. "Malcolm," she whispered, her tone pleading, "I was going to tell you. You were going to tell me." His words cracked like a whip. "When? After the vows? After the photographs? Or after you tricked me into this bed?" Her face flushed, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I didn't trick you. I love you. I only wanted a chance to be seen as I am, not what I used to be." But the word "used to be" lodged in his chest like a blade. The judge who had built a career on exposing liars, on punishing fraud and deceit, felt as though his entire life had been turned into a cruel joke. In his mind, this wasn't just secrecy, it was betrayal of the deepest order. His jaw clenched, his breath heavy. The stern figure who once silenced courtrooms now trembled with something far less controlled: rage. "You're a man," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "I'm your wife," Elena countered, her voice cracking. "I've lived as a woman for years. I am a woman. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you'd never give me a chance." For a fleeting second, silence filled the room, the hum of the city outside pressing against the windows like an unwanted audience. This could have been the moment where understanding bridged the divide, where compassion outweighed anger. But Malcolm Graves was not built for ambiguity. He was a man of absolutes, of black and white. And in that moment, he saw red. His hand moved faster than thought, clamping around her throat. Elena gasped, her eyes wide with shock as she clawed at his wrists, her nails digging into his skin. He squeezed harder, his teeth bared, the veins in his temple bulging as years of control and discipline shattered under the weight of humiliation. "Malcolm, please," she choked, her voice rasping as tears streamed down her cheeks. But her pleas only fueled him. To him, every word was another lie, every breath another insult. The image of himself as a dignified judge, as a man admired and respected, warped and collapsed. In his mind, she had dragged him into ruin. And in that frenzy of betrayal, he decided there was only one way to silence the truth. The struggle was brief but brutal. When his hands finally released, Elena collapsed against the bed, her once pristine gown twisted and wrinkled, her face slack and still. The room, moments earlier filled with gasps and desperate words, now echoed only with Malcolm's ragged breathing. He stumbled backward, staring at his hands as though they no longer belonged to him. The gold wedding band gleamed under the lamp's light, mocking him. He sank into a chair, his chest heaving. The city lights glittered indifferently beyond the glass, while inside, the most intimate room in the hotel had transformed into a crime scene. The champagne glasses sat untouched, the cake waited uneaten, and the judge, once the arbiter of right and wrong, was now frozen beside the lifeless body of the woman he had vowed to protect. Hours passed in a haze. He didn't run. He didn't call the police. He simply sat, staring at the corpse in the wedding dress, his mind caught between disbelief and dawning horror. The man who had spent decades deciding the fates of others now waited in silence for his own fate to arrive. When the knock finally came at dawn, a polite tap from a hotel attendant carrying a breakfast tray, Malcolm didn't move. The door creaked open, and a scream split the air, echoing down the hall. The fairy tale was over. By sunrise, news crews would swarm the hotel, and the country would soon learn the truth. A wedding night that began with champagne and promises had ended in betrayal, violence, and the ruin of a man once thought untouchable. The crime scene inside the Bellington Hotel suite looked more like the aftermath of a war than the remnants of a wedding night. Detectives stepped into the penthouse around 6:45 a.m., guided by shaken hotel staff who had already given their first horrified statements. Rose petals lay scattered across the marble floor, now trampled by hurried footsteps. A silver champagne bucket had tipped over, spilling water across the carpet. And there, at the center of it all, Elena's lifeless body rested on the bed, her once immaculate gown twisted and stained, the lace collar torn where the judge's hands had pressed down hardest. Detective Carla Hughes, a veteran of homicide with a reputation for composure, surveyed the room in silence. She was no stranger to violent death, but even she had to pause at the sight of the groom, Judge Malcolm Graves, sitting at the edge of an armchair, his face gray, his hands still trembling. He didn't resist when officers cuffed him. He didn't argue. He didn't even look up. He was just gone. One officer whispered later, like he'd already sentenced himself. The medical examiner's team began their work immediately. Photographs captured every detail. The bruising around Elena's neck, the broken clasp of her necklace, the faint defensive scratches on Malcolm's wrists where her nails had clawed in vain. Fingerprint dusting revealed smudges only consistent with the couple themselves. No signs of an intruder, no forced entry, no robbery gone wrong. Jewelry lay untouched on the dresser, wallets still in the bedside drawer. This wasn't theft. This was personal. By mid-morning, Elena's body was transported to the county morgue for autopsy. The preliminary findings were straightforward: death by manual strangulation, with clear evidence of pressure applied for an extended period. Her hyoid bone was fractured, a classic indicator of lethal force. Toxicology reports later showed no drugs or alcohol in her system beyond the champagne she had sipped at the reception. She had gone into her wedding night sober and trusting and never walked out. Investigators turned their attention to the timeline. Witnesses at the reception confirmed that the couple had left together just after midnight, appearing affectionate and even playful as they stepped into the elevator. Security cameras captured them entering the suite at 12:17 a.m. After that, the cameras recorded no one else. No suspicious figures in the hallway. No disturbances reported by neighboring rooms. The only sounds anyone recalled were muffled thumps around 2 a.m., brushed off at the time as nothing more than honeymoon enthusiasm. As detectives interviewed hotel staff, the shocking motive began to surface. One attendant, overhearing fragments of early police chatter, repeated the claim. The judge had discovered that his new bride was transgender, and the revelation had set off a violent rage. At first, it sounded like rumor, the kind of gossip that swirls instantly around a high-profile crime. But investigators quickly confirmed details in Elena's background: sealed medical documents, fragments of her past pieced together from official records. It was true. The secret she had carried so carefully into her marriage had come spilling into the public record, now entwined forever with her death. When detectives confronted Malcolm at the station, he offered no elaborate denial. Instead, he muttered fragments, his voice low, almost inaudible. "She lied to me. She tricked me. I couldn't let it stand." His words weren't the practiced statements of a judge defending himself. They were raw, disjointed, dripping with shame and fury. For investigators, it was as close to a confession as they could hope for. Meanwhile, the press circled like vultures. Within hours of the discovery, satellite trucks lined the street outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions over each other. "Judge Graves? Why did you kill her? Did you know before the wedding? Was this a crime of passion or premeditated?" Images of the judge being led in handcuffs, still in his wedding tuxedo, the bow tie undone, his face ashen, flashed across every screen in America. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man who had spent decades handing down sentences now stood accused of the very crime he had condemned in others. Back at the crime lab, technicians combed through every inch of the suite. The wedding dress, still clinging to Elena's body during autopsy, bore the marks of the struggle, fabric torn at the neckline, tiny flecks of blood from broken capillaries where the pressure had been most severe. The carpet fibers held traces of her nail polish, where she had clawed desperately during the attack. Underneath Malcolm's fingernails, lab results revealed faint traces of her skin cells, undeniable evidence of direct violence. Detectives also pulled digital records. Elena's phone, retrieved from her clutch, contained text messages to a close friend in the days leading up to the wedding. "I'm scared to tell him," one read. "What if he leaves me? What if he can't forgive me?" Another, sent just hours before the ceremony, said simply, "Pray for me. Tonight, I'll have to tell him." Those messages painted a chilling picture. Elena had been preparing to reveal her truth, hoping love would outweigh prejudice. Instead, her fear proved prophetic. As the investigation closed in, there was little room for ambiguity. The prosecution's case was already writing itself. Opportunity, motive, physical evidence, and even the defendant's own damning words. The tragedy wasn't just that a woman had been killed on her wedding night. It was that her killer was the very man who had once sworn to uphold justice without bias. By the end of that first day, Judge Malcolm Graves was formally charged with murder. His mugshot circulated online within hours. The once formidable judge staring blankly into the camera, tuxedo collar still visible, eyes empty. The contrast with his public image, the stern figure in a robe, gavel in hand, was enough to make the nation's collective stomach churn. The investigation had laid the groundwork, but the trial ahead promised to be even more explosive. This wasn't just about a killing in a hotel room. It was about identity, truth, prejudice, and the terrifying question of what happens when the man trusted to deliver justice decides he's above the law. The trial of Judge Malcolm Graves was unlike anything the state or the nation had ever seen. From the very first day, it felt less like a courtroom proceeding and more like a collision between law, morality, and spectacle. Every morning, the courthouse steps turned into a stage. Protesters clashed with supporters. Rainbow flags waved alongside signs that read, "Justice for Elena," and "Lies deserve punishment." Satellite trucks lined the block, reporters jockeying for position as if they were covering the Super Bowl. Talk shows and podcasts dissected every detail, turning the once revered judge into the most infamous defendant in America. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was no less charged. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, many of whom had camped out overnight just to secure a seat. The gallery was a mosaic of emotions. Grieving friends of Elena, stern colleagues of the judge, activists, law students, and ordinary citizens curious to witness the fall of the man who once embodied authority. The air smelled faintly of coffee and tension, every whisper swallowed by the sheer gravity of the proceedings. When Malcolm was led in, shackled and pale, a hush fell over the room. Gone was the towering figure in the black robe. He now wore a plain gray suit that hung loose on his frame, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow. His eyes rarely left the table in front of him. For years, lawyers had stood before him with their fates in his hands. Now, he was the one awaiting judgment. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone. Assistant District Attorney Carlin Nguyen, sharp and unflinching, stood before the jury and painted a picture of betrayal turned to brutality. "This was not an accident," she declared, her voice echoing against the paneled walls. "This was not a momentary lapse. This was the deliberate killing of a woman who trusted him with her love and her life. On the very night she pledged herself to him, he strangled her with his bare hands." Her words landed like hammer strikes, the jury's eyes fixed on her as she laid out the roadmap of the case. The physical evidence, the text messages, the defendant's own incriminating statements. The defense countered with a different narrative. Let attorney Samuel Breyer, a polished litigator known for his ability to humanize even the most controversial clients, framed the act as a tragedy of passion and deception. Judge Graves was misled, he argued. He was blindsided on the most intimate night of his life. Faced with a revelation that shattered his understanding of truth, he reacted in a moment of uncontrollable emotion. This was not murder. It was the consequence of shock, betrayal, and humiliation. His words sought not to excuse the killing, but to recast it as something less than premeditated, something more akin to manslaughter than cold-blooded homicide. The witnesses brought the story into sharp focus. Hotel staff described the eerie silence of the suite, the scream that pierced the morning when the door was opened, the sight of Malcolm sitting motionless beside the body. The medical examiner walked the jury through photographs of Elena's injuries, pointing to the bruises on her neck, the fractured hyoid bone, the desperate scratches that proved she had fought to live. Each image projected on the courtroom screen drew audible gasps from the gallery. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from Elena's closest friend, who read aloud the text messages Elena had sent in the hours before her death. Her voice broke as she recited, "I'm scared to tell him. What if he can't forgive me?" The words hung in the air, a devastating reminder that Elena had anticipated rejection but never imagined violence. Several jurors visibly swallowed back tears. The defense attempted to chip away at the prosecution's case. They highlighted Malcolm's clean record, his decades of service, his reputation as a man of principle. They argued that Elena's secrecy, however sympathetic, had created an emotional bomb that exploded under the pressure of the wedding night. Breyer even tried to frame Malcolm's lack of flight, his decision to sit in the suite for hours afterward, as proof of remorse rather than malice. He didn't run, Breyer insisted. He didn't hide. He was broken, devastated, consumed by what had happened. But the prosecution anticipated every move. ADA Nguyen reminded the jury that remorse after the fact does not erase intent in the moment. She replayed Malcolm's own words during interrogation. "She lied to me. I couldn't let it stand." To Nguyen, this wasn't remorse. It was confession. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day adding new layers of complexity. Legal scholars debated whether the revelation of Elena's transgender identity should be considered a provocation or a prejudice. Activists warned that framing it as provocation risked legitimizing violence against transgender people everywhere. News outlets aired fiery debates, pitting commentators against one another in primetime slots. To the public, the case became more than a murder trial. It was a referendum on truth, identity, and the limits of tolerance. The climax came during closing arguments. ADA Nguyen's voice thundered through the courtroom. Malcolm Graves stood for decades as the symbol of justice in this state. But on his wedding night, he decided he was above the very law he swore to uphold. He punished Elena not for a crime, but for being who she was. And for that, there must be accountability. She turned to the jury, her gaze unwavering. No one, not even a judge, is above the law. When Breyer rose for his final plea, his tone was softer, almost mournful. "This case is about tragedy," he said. "Two lives destroyed by secrets and fear. We ask you not to see a monster, but a man, flawed, broken, undone in a single night." The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The words detonated in the courtroom. Elena's friends embraced, sobbing. Activists outside erupted in cheers. Malcolm sat stone still, his face betraying neither shock nor sorrow, only a grim acceptance, as if the gavel had finally come down on him. At sentencing, the judge presiding over the case spoke with deliberate weight. "You, who once judged others, now stand judge yourself. The law is blind, and today it sees you clearly. Life in prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, but Malcolm never looked up. The man who had once commanded silence with a single glance was now just another prisoner, his legacy obliterated in the very house where he once held power. Outside, as the sun set over the courthouse, crowds chanted Elena's name. News anchors called it the trial of the decade, a case that would be studied in law schools and debated in living rooms for years to come. The fall of Judge Malcolm Graves was complete. Not just the end of a career, but the dismantling of an image, the collapse of a symbol. And for the nation watching, the message was clear: justice does not bow to power, reputation, or fear. The verdict was read, the sentence delivered, but the echoes of Judge Malcolm Graves' fall did not end inside the courtroom. If anything, that was only the beginning. Outside, the courthouse steps turned into a stage of national reckoning. Rainbow flags waved alongside placards that read "Justice for Elena" and "No excuses for hate." Candlelight vigils sprouted in cities across the country, strangers gathering to honor a woman many had never met but now felt they knew intimately. Elena became more than a victim. She became a symbol, her story woven into the broader struggle for acceptance and dignity. For the LGBTQ+ community, the case was both heartbreaking and galvanizing. Advocacy groups pointed out that Elena's murder was not just an isolated act of rage, but part of a larger pattern of violence against transgender people. They invoked her name at rallies, on talk shows, and in op-eds. Hashtags like #JusticeForElena and #NoOneAboveTheLaw trended for weeks. College campuses held panel discussions on identity, truth, and safety. Even late-night comedians, usually quick to move on from heavy stories, spoke somberly about the tragedy, reminding audiences that bias could kill even in the most unexpected places. In the legal world, the shock cut even deeper. Colleagues who had once admired Malcolm now struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the killer he had become. Law students studied the case in real time, their professors urging them to see it as a lesson. Authority does not equal integrity. Judges, attorneys, and clerks whispered about how someone who embodied the law could succumb so completely to prejudice. The black robe, once seen as a shield of impartiality, now felt like a costume concealing a flawed and dangerous man. The families caught in the middle bore the heaviest burdens. Elena's relatives, who had traveled from out of state, spoke tearfully at press conferences. Her sister clutched a framed photo of Elena laughing, insisting she only wanted to be loved for who she was. That should never cost someone their life. Her words struck a chord with millions, replayed across every major network. Meanwhile, Malcolm's children, who had once defended their father's reputation, withdrew from public view entirely. Friends said they were devastated, not only by the crime itself, but by the collapse of the legacy that had shaped their lives. Inside prison walls, Malcolm became a paradox. Some inmates viewed him with contempt, relishing the downfall of the man who had once sent many of them away. Others were strangely deferential, still seeing him as a figure of authority, even in chains. But Malcolm himself was a ghost of who he had been. Guards described him as quiet, withdrawn, spending long hours staring at the walls of his cell. The man who had once commanded silence with a gavel now lived in silence imposed by four concrete walls. The broader culture continued to debate what his actions revealed. Was Malcolm's violence the product of personal betrayal, or was it the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of prejudice left unchecked? Some commentators argued that the trial risked setting a dangerous precedent, suggesting the discovery of a partner's identity could ever be considered a mitigating factor. Others insisted the conviction was a watershed moment, proving that society would no longer tolerate panicked defenses rooted in bigotry. Books, documentaries, and podcasts soon followed. One investigative series traced Malcolm's career, piecing together moments where his rulings hinted at rigid, uncompromising views about morality and family. Another documentary, The Wedding Night Murder, intercut footage of Elena's friends and activists with archival clips of Malcolm presiding in court, the contrast as jarring as it was tragic. The story was no longer just news. It had entered the fabric of cultural memory. And yet, beyond the noise of pundits and headlines, the human cost remained stark. Elena was gone. A life filled with potential, laughter, and love had ended on the very night it was supposed to begin anew. Her funeral drew hundreds, many wearing white ribbons in her honor. As her casket was lowered, a choir sang softly, their voices carrying into the crisp autumn air. For her family and friends, justice in a courtroom could never fill the void left behind. As for Malcolm, his legacy was rewritten in a single night. Once described as the hammer of justice, his name now evoked disgrace. Law textbooks would forever place his case alongside discussions of judicial ethics and bias. In the end, he became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that power without compassion can curdle into violence. The story closed where it had begun, not in a courtroom or a courthouse, but in the intimate silence of a wedding night. A night that was meant to seal a bond instead revealed a secret, and in revealing it, unraveled two lives at once. The tragedy lay not just in the act of murder, but in everything it represented. Fear triumphing over love, prejudice extinguishing possibility, and the fall of a man who had once been trusted to weigh truth above all else. For the nation watching, the lesson was clear. Titles, robes, and reputations may create the illusion of moral certainty, but beneath them, every person faces the same choices between hate and acceptance, between justice and violence. Malcolm Graves made his choice, and with it, he destroyed not only his life and Elena's, but the faith of an entire country in the man who once seemed untouchable. By the time the news cycle moved on, Elena's name still lingered in vigils, in hashtags, in conversations whispered late at night. Her story remained a reminder that secrets do not kill, but prejudice does. And for all his years on the bench, Judge Malcolm Graves had rendered his final verdict not in a courtroom, but in a hotel suite where love was supposed to begin and instead ended in silence.